Hey everyone, Tactics here, and as promised, I'll be giving you guys my updated thoughts here on tanks for the launch of the War Within in competitive raid and Mythic Plus content. There's been quite a few changes, of course, since the last time we really spoke in depth about tanks. There's been, of course, the big nerfs, as well as several rounds of buffs after that, and on top of that, testing eye level for Mythic Plus was actually increased from 613 to 626, which is still about 12 off of what your cap is going to be in terms of eye level in the first season, but it does give us a better idea of how tanks are going to feel when they're more geared. Now, before getting into all that stuff, I do have a shameless plug. If you're looking to prep for season 1 of the expansion here, or you just want to see what you're going to be dealing with in dungeons, my tracking sheet is now publicly available. It's linked in the description below. Basically just has, all the dungeons abilities, what dispels are going to be in a dungeon, easier to see now as well, including bleeds. We've also added a couple highly requested features, including boss abilities that is now included, and we even have the an MDT route, a picture, and a link directly to it if you want it for yourself. So a lot of improvements here. I'm also going to be putting out Mythic Plus guides, raid guides, all that stuff on my channel, and written guides on the Method website as well. So make sure you are subbed to the channel for all of that content. It's free to do, and it is the best way to support me. Again, this is in the description below for you guys. Now, plug is out of the way. Usual disclaimer for tier list videos here. I'm going to be focusing on what I think is going to be good and meta at the highest end, right? So we're talking about like 0.1% title keys. What are you going to likely see? What are you going to likely see Hall of Fame guilds running as their tanks? Outside of that, though, you can play whatever you want and succeed. Honestly, even inside of those categories, you see players that play off meta specs and still get the title. They still get Hall of Fame or raid at an extremely high level, right? So don't let any video, including this one, discourage you from playing a spec that you really, really enjoy, whether that's thematically, playstyle, whatever that is. Now, because I am focusing on the higher end, something to consider here is a lot of the times tank power is only one of the numbers in the equation, right? Sometimes you need to consider the raid buff situation or the unique utility situation, particularly in raid. That's very, very important, right? So that is something that we have to take into account here. And also part of that is how strong are the other specs of this class that also bring the same raid buff? Because if they're strong, that can take away from a tank spec. If they're weak, that can actually boost up a tank spec. So that is something else we're considering. Sometimes you're going to see a powerful tank get a lower rank because of that situation. Now let's get things started here. We're going to do Mythic Plus on the left, Raid on the right, and I'm going to immediately be have my comments filled with angry Death Knight players because we're putting blood in the B tier. I am a known Blood DK hater in terms of the current design of the spec and how it's going to survive into higher keys. I mentioned this in previous videos. People got mad in the comments. I am doubling down. Like, I don't think Blood DK is going to be your top tank. It has some great output. I think a problem with the earlier testing is that we were seeing Blood DK, and we weren't actually seeing it pushed into high enough keys where you would run into the main issue it has, where you just get to a key level where it is extremely difficult and dangerous for you to get into every single pull without, falling over. That remains an issue for Blood DK. We did see some adjustments where Bone Storm, after the recent time we talked, was now allowed to CDR Rune Weapon, which is really nice, but then they halved the number of charges it uses, being 5 now instead of 10, and you're still just going to have kind of those downtimes, which can be very, very dangerous. Again, not saying you can't do it. I'm sure there's going to be people still getting title and stuff like that on Blood DK, but that combined with the fact that you're not actually bringing great utility or a raid buff to the comp is definitely something that's pretty negative for Blood DK. Their personal damage is still extremely high, right? Their self-sustain is not an issue. They are still the most self-sustaining tank. The Death Strike nerfs, including that, it's not really a big deal for them. Like I've mentioned several times, that's not the issue with Blood DK, but it's the fact that, like, what are they actually bringing to your group? We have grips, but that's kind of relatively niche. The AoE slow is kind of niche, but good. AMZ is like probably their biggest, most valuable item they have. Then Control Undead is niche. I don't know if there's any actually uses for it this season. I think there's got to be a couple uses for Control Undead, but again, relatively niche and relatively low value. not having a dispel is pretty impactful in this season. So if you're a tank and you want to do like weekly keys, I think Blood Decay is a fantastic option, because you know you're not going to be reliant on healers like some of these other tank specs are, and it's all going to be in your hands, which is nice. But as you start pushing into higher keys, it's going to be harder and harder to survive on a Blood Decay, in my opinion. Once you're in, you're good, but getting in is that issue. Joining Blood Decay here in the B tier, I'm going to put Prot Paladin. Damage wise, a little bit less than Blood Decay, and they're okay in damage. The main thing is their talent tree still kind of forces them to pick, and so like sometimes in Mythic Plus build, you'll have solid AoE damage, but your single target damage will be a bit lacking because it's hard to pick up all of those talents while getting your Mythic Plus stuff, something other tanks don't necessarily need to worry about. Also defensively, after the tank nerfs, they got some compensation buffs, but they're still going to have like gaps in their mitigation, especially in season 1 when you're a lower haste value. The Sentinel, both duration reduction and CDR reduction hurt. The Eye of Tear duration reduction hurt. You're going to have those gaps. Your consecration gaps are going to be drastically reduced, however, so that is a benefit. And I think potentially later on in the expansion, it's going to actually be significantly positive for them with the changes to, you know, Sanctuary, allowing you to maintain full consecration uptime. But at least for the first season of the expansion with the lower haste, it is a bit rough. They do have a raid buff, of course, Diva Aura. No offensive benefit, but Diva Aura is solid. Holy Paladin is also quite good from my understanding. I'm not 100% sure on that one. But the big thing that Prot Paladins bring is their interrupts. With the philosophy shift to stops, or away from stops rather, towards interrupts in season 1 of the War Within, Paladin interrupts are insanely valuable. They're insanely valuable. They're so good. They also bring that poison dispel, which is quite good. And of course, Paladin utility, just the whole kit, is quite generally powerful in most dungeons, right? You have the freedom, you have the bopper spell warding, and of course you have the 1-minute sack. They are a bit more healer reliant, especially comparatively to like Blood Decay, right? Because of those defensive changes. And again, defensively, they're a bit lower, and offensively, they kind of have to choose, where generally you're going to be pretty solid in AoE damage, but your single target's going to be a bit lower. So because of that, despite their good utility, I'm going to put them down in the B tier. But like I said, probably also not a bad tank to do for weekly keys, because you just get to interrupt literally everything. Now, moving up to the A tier, I'm going to start with Brew. This is probably one of the most stable tanks in terms of just like their health. They, of course, will need a lot of healer retention just because of how Stagger works and how their health bar works, but they are exceptionally tanky, and especially with the recent Shadow Pan buffs, you know, you get a pretty significant passive DR and just passive gains in general from that tree, and you're just a very tanky, stable spec when it comes to incoming damage. Their personal damage is also very high. They bring that Mystic Touch raid buff, but this is definitely one of the weaker raid buffs in general, especially if there's no physical specific damage dealers, right? Because not only do they have to be attack power scaling, they have to be a spec that deals a lot of their damage as physical, and those are not as common as they've been in the past. So the raid buff is kind of meh. They also have a Poison Dispel, like I mentioned with Paladin. Poison Dispel is pretty solid this season, rather. Poison Dispel and Curse Dispels are both going to be the two most valuable. They bring poison, so it's pretty good. Monk utility is generally fine. I put it weaker than Paladin utility, of course, but you've got things like the big AoE stun and leg sweep, paralysis, which can be a soothe now, and the Pararop for some skips, and Tiger's Lust, which is also going to be useful on some of the dungeons as a root break. But just generally, it's just not quite the best in any single category, and so that's why I'm going to put them in A tier. Still a very solid tank. Still, I'm having a ton of fun playing Brewmaster after the rework, but it's just a little lacking in each category, which is why you know, it's solid, but it's not the best option. Also in the A tier, we're going to put Protection Warriors. This, I would say, is probably the most durable tank overall. There is something to be said about just being able to switch around a few talents in the first season of an expansion, no matter what your stats are, and still maintain 100% shield block uptime. That is super valuable in keys where the vast majority of the damage intake that is hitting you is physical and blockable, especially with recent changes, hotfixes over the past month or so since we've talked, to make tank busters and boss abilities that previously were not blockable now blockable. That's been a huge boon to Protection Warrior, who has that 100% block uptime compared to something like Paladin, who's not going to block every attack, right? Much bigger for Prot Warrior durability comparatively. Damage-wise, they're on the burstier end. They're fine, but they're not anything to write home about. That being said, Spell Reflect, and there are a few really good Spell Reflect dungeons, you can absolutely crank in those dungeons. It's really powerful, especially if you can charge in and force some random target casters to actually target you off the rip. Utility wise is always kind of where Prot Warrior is lacking. Battle Shout is good for any physical DPS, not just specific ones like the monk buff, but the problem is, are physical DPS going to be good? Right now it's a bit of a question mark, right? Casters are looking good, they have been looking good, but AUG has been nerfed a couple times. Is AUG going to actually fall out of favor? If it does slightly fall out of favor, that is very good for Protection Warriors, because they're one of the tanks that benefits the least from the actual defensive benefits that Evoker provides. And also that would potentially encourage a physical comp that could squeak in there, right? And that would be very beneficial for Prot Warrior as well with Battle Shout, which is why they're kind of my sleeper pick here is the Prot Warrior. If AUG Evoker falls out of favor, if more physical DPS specs start coming into favor, that could be very good. Now, Disrupting Shout. This is actually quite good in terms of utility provided. It's really like the main utility Prot Warriors bring, obviously outside of Battle Shout. They have AoE stops, but that's really it. Disrupting Shout is optional. First off, you're probably not going to take in every dungeon, and in dungeons that you don't want it, you can take increased rage generation, even more rage generation, but it is extremely powerful in dungeons where you kind of have a bunch of these pulls with multiple casters in it. It's essentially a silent sigil if you hit it, right? So that's a very good button. Downside, no Dispel, unlike Brew and Paladin. That is going to hurt it a little bit, but you know, it's something that can technically be compensated for with the rest of your comp. So that is my sleeper pick, is the Prot Warrior. But then we move up into the S tier, and I am dropping the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Yes, stories of their demise have been greatly exaggerated. They are for sure the highest personal damage tank, though potentially there's going to be a nerf coming their way, but their damage is crazy. Their damage is absolutely insane. Focused into Soul Cleave specifically, and Fellsguard really does help shore up some of their weaknesses that they would see at the start of the expansion, with cooldown uptime, like things like meta uptime are way up. You can also get Sigil of Flame uptime a bit up, but a lot of people seem to be favoring the double fiery brand build. Also makes you a lot tankier outside of meta, but they are still going to have those gaps in their defensives, especially in season 1. So you're either going to need to kite, or you're going to need externals, or just significant healer attention in general during those moments. You're not going to be able to get full uptime on your meta or fiery brand or spikes. There is going to be gaps, and that makes this probably a bit harder than some of the other tanks to actually play around. And we talked about the personal damage, but also keep in mind, they bring Chaos Brand, right? Chaos Brand, if you're running a caster meta, which again is what it kind of looked like on beta, but it's a bit up in the air. But in a caster or magic damage meta, Chaos Brand is an insane amount of damage, right? It is very good. And so bringing that on top of having very high personal damage makes Vengeance just like the clear highest damage you can bring from the tank role. In terms of unique utility, again, they're lacking in the Dispel department, but they bring their sigils, and most importantly, like Silent Sigil, even just a single charge of it is still quite strong, as is Misery for doing skips. There are definitely some spots where you're like, hey, do we really want to pull this 3-pack? We kind of want to pull things past it. Misery skipping in that situation is super good. Imprison, allowing you to do some skips, though that can be replaced by several other abilities, but it's definitely one of my top tank choices for the first season of the War Within. That brings us to what I think is the other best tank here, and that is Guardian Druids. Their damage is kind of a bit dependent on what they're playing. Druid of the Claw does a ton of damage in all situations. It falls behind Elun's Chosen in mass AoE, but Elun's Chosen has pretty bad single target. The problem is kind of a one of consistency, where Druid of the Claw is a little bit reliant, I would say, on Shaman being in the comp to get those Wind Fury Totem procs become more consistent with some of their bigger abilities. That being said, Shaman is looking quite good, so potentially there is going to be a Shaman in the comp, but otherwise Elun's Chosen is still pretty solid, if a little lower boss damage. Now, Mark of the Wild, of course, is an insane raid buff. It brings damage, it brings healing, and it brings survivability for all of your team. And so while it's not as much damage as Vengeance, even in the high end, it's still a respectable amount of damage, and it brings a bit of defensiveness. So we'll have to see how the meta actually shakes out in terms of, are keys going to be something you need to optimize damage for, or are they something you just need to survive, right? Because that could impact it. Dispel-wise, they have the best Dispel out of any tank this season. Poison plus Curse, those are the two most prominent debuff types in Season 1, and Guardian Druid brings both. They also can easily access their Dispel after the general tree changes, so you're going to always have your Dispel, and it's going to be useful in almost every single dungeon, which is something not every other tank spec can actually say. Druid utility wise, it's just kind of fine, right? It's nothing to write home about. There's nothing insane. I would say, like, you know, the Silent Sigil, the Misery Skips are probably more relevant than anything Guardian brings. Druid utility is just there, right? Ursouls is pretty good in some spots. Typhoon's pretty good some spots. Get a little speed, but the whole package Guardian brings right now, I think, is probably the best out of any of the tanks. They're also exceptionally sturdy against trash, right? Where Vengeance, right? If you have those gaps, it's a little bit more problematic for them. Vengeance is probably a bit better to deal with boss fights specifically, but if you're planning properly as Guardian and you're not getting greedy with your damage, you can also spread out your sieges enough and plan it out well enough to be more than fine on boss fights. So this is what we're looking at for Mythic Plus. Now let's shift gears to Raid, where things like bringing an important raid buff is significantly more impactful, right? If another class is weak, like we talked about at the beginning, or a spec story in your class is weak, it can be very, very relevant to the state of what tanks you're bringing. We're going to have a few tanks here then in B tier because of how that is working, not because the tanks themselves are bad, but because they don't bring either unique utility on their own, and the other specs in their class that bring the same raid buff are quite competitive. So off the top here, we're going to put Prot Warrior, we're going to put Brewmaster, and we're going to put Vengeance all in the B tier for Raid, because I think Fury in Arms are looking decent, Windwalker is looking decent. Not sure what the state of Mistweaver is, to be honest, and Havoc is actually looking quite good for these specs. And if you actually look at what are these specs bringing to a Raid, right? Vengeance is like Darkness, which can also be brought by Havoc. Sigils, which not all of them can be brought by Havoc, but are sigils usually relevant in Raid? The answer is no. Brewmaster, same deal. Outside of potentially niche things where Transcendence can help you from specifically the tank role, they're not really bringing you anything over what a Windwalker or a Mistweaver would. Prot Warrior, exactly the same, right? There's spell reflect value is not usually a thing in Raid compared to Mythic Plus, and so you're just bringing a warrior buff, and I think most likely you're going to see people bring a DPS warrior to bring that buff. Moving up a tier, we're going to drop here Paladin, and we're going to drop Bear here as well. So again, bringing raid buffs. Guardian Druid, I think, is looking like probably the best option to bring Mark of the Wild. Again, that could change with tuning, but currently the DPS specs for Druid tuning is not great, and Resto Druid is also kind of okay, but I think from the tank spot, this is probably the most likely raid buff that you would see brought by a tank and not by a DPS or healer. For Prot Paladin, I think you're likely not going to see them bring the raid buff specifically. I think Holy Paladin is likely going to be that option, and of course Ret Aura is gone, so there isn't a second Paladin raid buff. That being said, in raids, when you don't have to use those talents in Mythic Plus stuff that you need for Mythic Plus, they have very, very good single target damage, like not the #1 damage, but very, very competitive. And they also have spell warding, right? Spell warding is unique to Prot Paladin, and that is something that they can bring that no one else in the game can bring. So if there is some cheeky spell wardings on the last boss or the second last boss, that is a way for Prot Paladin to sneak in. I don't think the raid buff is going to be their reason to be there, because Holy Paladin is looking to be very, very solid, but because their output on their own is powerful, as is Guardian Druid, by the way. Guardian Druid output relative to other tanks is very, very high in the raid build, which involves cat weaving actually, which is kind of cool. But because their own output, their personal output, is very powerful, and they have that unique niche, I would say that Paladin is probably a little bit more likely to be brought than one of these tanks, which again, good output, but they don't really have anything unique, and their other specs are quite good. That leaves us with the King of Raids still on top. Yes, DK, like I said, their self-sustain is still perfectly fine. They do not need the help of a healer whatsoever. They do a ridiculous amount of damage. They have grips. Grips are looking to be quite relevant on a few boss fights. There are also adds on the final boss. We don't know if grips are going to be relevant there, but you know, there is at least the opportunity for grips to be relevant there. And of course, Blood DK is just the best at gripping out of any of the DK specs. So I think it would be very, very surprising if any of the top guilds didn't run a Blood DK. I honestly wouldn't even be surprised if you see top guilds running 2 Blood DKs. I think that's totally within the realm of possibility. It's just that good. And because, you know, again, difficulty is not infinitely scaling like it is in Mythic Plus. Both Blood DK and Prop Paladin kind of benefit from that. In terms of, you know, Blood DK is not going to run into their big issue because, you know, you're in the boss fight. You know, you're there the whole time. You can have another tank start if you really need to, but Blood DK is just really, really tanky when the damage is more predictable like that. And Prop Paladin is just tanky enough to deal with that. It's not going to run into any problem, so both of those are just fine. But there we have it, guys. Those are my tank rankings for Raid and Mythic Plus for the launch of War Within. Let me know what you think. Am I delusional? What are you planning to main? Drop them all in the comments below. And remember to subscribe, as I have a ton of guide content for dungeons, for raid bosses, and even tank specs coming in the near future. Otherwise, thank you to my amazing Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.